Hi everyone, my name is Will Valida. I'm a software engineer and cloud architect, and in this video, we're going to learn how we can protect our Azure Container Apps using Azure Application Gateway. So in a previous video, I talked about how we could use or enable HTTP ingress for our container apps so we can accept traffic from the public internet. I also talked about in that video about how we can actually disable HTTP ingress so we can only limit communications between our container apps within our container app environment. And one of the questions coming out of that was, would you actually do that in your production scenarios? And the answer really is no. So when you're hosting your apps or microservices in Azure Container Apps, you may not always want to publish them directly onto the internet. Instead, you might want to expose them, or you may want to expose them, through a reverse proxy. Now, a reverse proxy is just a service that sits in front of one or more services, intercepting and directing incoming traffic to the appropriate destination, such as a container app. Now, reverse proxies also allow you to place services in front of your applications that support cross-cutting functionality, including routing, caching, rate limiting, load balancing, security layers, and also request filtering. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through an example in Bicep. We're actually going to build out a sample that protects our container apps using a web application firewall on Azure Application Gateway with an internal container app environment. So there's a couple of prerequisites that we need for this. We first off need an internal environment with a custom VNet. So in this project directory on Visual Studio Code that I've got so far, I've got a couple of Bicep modules that I've created from scratch. So I've got my log analytics workspace. I've also created a virtual network along with a subnet, which I'm going to use to integrate with my Azure Container App environment. Now, just looking at that subnet address, /23, depending on what kind of Azure Container App environment you're going to be provisioning, whether you're going to use consumption or workload profiles, that will determine the size of your subnet. So I'm going to just be using a plain old consumption one, and the subnet size has to be 23. But for workload profiles, I believe at the current time of recording, it's 27. I'll leave a description, some documentation in the video description of this video. So if that changes over time, you'll always have that link to refer to as to what size your subnet should be. And I'm also deploying, there's a couple of things before I move on from this virtual network. Bicep file, I've got my outputs, so the name of that virtual network and also the ID for that subnet, because that's something we're going to need later. And if I go into my container app environment, I've just set it up like a normal container app environment. The only difference is here is I'm integrating it within this virtual network. So I'm passing through the ID of that subnet, and I'm also making it an internal environment as well. And if I look at my container app environment, we're not deploying anything special here. We're just using kind of like a hello world container app, but it's going to be deployed to our container app environment, which is internal. And I'm using all these modules within this main Bicep file. So I'm going to be storing this code on GitHub later, so you can refer to it and you can actually see what each module is doing as we build out this sample. So if I go into this resource group that I've got, so I've got all of these resources. Let me just refresh that for a little bit. There we go. So I've got this container app, also this container app environment. So if I go into that container app environment, I should see if I go, as you go back into the essentials, I can see that it's integrated with this virtual network. Sorry, if I just go, ooh, getting too excited with the clicks today. And if I go into my container app, I should see that this application URL, I shouldn't be able to access it from outside the public internet. So if I go ahead and click that, there you go. That site can't be reached because, again, our environment is an internal environment. And just to confirm that, I'll go back into the resource group, into the container app environment. And yeah, that's an internal environment. Awesome, cool. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back into my Bicep file. And there's a couple of things that we actually need before we start. So in this container app environment Bicep module, I've got a couple of outputs. So I've got the name of my container app environment, which I'm using for my container app, but I've also got the default domain for my container app environment. And I'm also exporting my static IP. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we're going to create and configure a private DNS, Azure Private DNS Zone. So what I'm going to do, under this networking folder here, I'm going to create a new Bicep file called private DNS zone.bicep. Cool, so now I can go ahead and start to configure my private DNS zone. So one thing I'm going to need to do, I'm going to need a parameter for the static IP. So UV static IP, that's going to be passed through as a string. And I'm also going to do that for my default domain as well. I've applying tags to all of my resources. It's just good practice to do that, to apply tags. So you can include stuff like who owns your resources, who's the point of contact, which department, stuff like that. That's just something I'm going to apply to all of my resources. So now what I need as well, I need the virtual machine, VNet name. And I'll pass that in as a parameter. So then I can use a resource sitting under Microsoft.network, but it's going to be that existing resource, virtual networks. There we go. Struggling to find the namespace. Cool. And then I'm just going to pass through the VNet name. Nice. So now I can go ahead and create my private DNS zone. So what I need to do is I'm just going to create my private DNS zone resource, and that sits under, again, Microsoft.network, but this time we're looking for private DNS zones. And for the name, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it the name of my container app default environment. Cool. So the location of this, it's going to be a global resource. I'm going to provide global as that, and I'm also going to apply tags to it. Fantastic. Cool, so now what we need to do is apply some record sets to this. And I'm going to start with a star record set. So I'm going to literally just call it that, star record set. And that sits under, not Microsoft private, but network private DNS zones. That's going to be an A record. So the name is just going to be star. The parent will be the private DNS zone, and then for the property, so I need to set a time to live. I'm just going to keep this as the default value for now, but then I'm going to add an A record, and then for that, it's going to be the static IP address from my container app environment. So what I need to do is add that as an IP version 4 address, and it's going to be my static IP for my container app environment. Fantastic. Cool, so now what I need to do is create an @record set. So record set, call that @record set. Again, that's going to be another Microsoft.network / private DNS zones A record. And name, it's going to be again, the parent private DNS zone. Coming into the properties as well, I'm going to keep it the same. So time to live is going to be exactly the same. And then the A records, again, is going to point to my container app static IP environment, IP address, sorry. Cool, so now what I need to do is I need to create a private DNS zone link, or a virtual network link, sorry, so I can actually connect this back into my virtual network. So what I need to do is create another resource. It's going to be a private DNS zone link. And again, Microsoft.network / private DNS zones. And I'm looking for virtual network links. There we go. Now for the name of this, I'm going to just go vnet.name -pdns link, not equals dash, typing as we go along, so lots of happy accidents. And then going to make the parent resource the private DNS zone. I'm going to apply tags to it. The location, again, this is another global resource, so I'll go ahead and do that. And then for the properties, registration enabled, I'm going to set that to false. And then for my virtual network, the ID is going to be set to the ID of my VNet. Cool, so with that set up, I can go into my main.bicep file, and now I can actually reference this create this private DNS zone. So that sits under network, private DNS zone. I'm going to go, just call this PDNS. So private DNS. Then for my container app, default domain, I'm going to use the container app default domain there. Also for the static IP, get that mouse out of the way so you guys can actually see it. The static IP as well. Apply the tags to it, and then actually use the virtual network name to say that this private DNS zone belongs to that virtual network. Cool, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run this Azure CLI deployment. I'm going to deploy everything through the CLI, so I'm just going to run that, and that's going to go ahead and create my private DNS zone. So through the power of video editing, I'm going to make this a really short process. We'll let that run, and we'll come back a little bit later. Cool, so that looks like it's been successfully deployed. So if I go into my Azure subscription, I can see my private DNS zone has been created. So if I go into that, I can see that my record sets have been created. And if I look at my virtual network links, I can see that that's been created as well. Fantastic. Cool, so now we're ready to go ahead and create and configure our application gateway. So make sure I'm on the right screen. Fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new Bicep file called application gateway or app gateway.bicep. And what I'll do, I'll copy and paste some parameters because there's quite a few. And I'll just explain what all of this is for. So I'm going to give my application gateway a name. There's going to be an IP address that's going to be deployed. I'm going to integrate this within my virtual network, so I'm going to need a subnet for that. I'm also going to integrate my subnet that I've got for my container app environment. I also need my fully qualified domain name for my container app itself. I'm going to create a private link service and also the location and tags, fairly straightforward. Cool, so let me go ahead and start creating our application gateway. So create a new resource, app gateway. This sits under Microsoft.network namespace, and I'm looking for application gateways. I'm going to give it a name, location, and provide it the tags as well. Now, it's a zonal service, so I can apply 1 or 3 zones to my application gateway. I'm just going to use the 1 for now. Then for my properties, let's think about SKU. So I'm not going to be using a WAF for this. So I'll just use a standard version 2 of application gateway. I'm really creating a bare bones application gateway for this. If you need a WAF, please use a WAF and then also enable WAF policies as well. So before I go ahead and add anything more to this application gateway, I'm going to go into my virtual network. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add another variable because we're creating a new subnet. So this is going to be my app gateway subnet name. And this is going to be called app gateway -subnet. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create a new subnet for my application gateway. So properties and then the address prefix. Let's go ahead and just assign it. Make sure that's the right one. Oh, no, that should be a 224. And also what I want to do is I'm going to disable private link service network policies on that gateway as well. Going to go ahead and create my sub resource for this as well as an existing resource so we don't lose it during deployment. And then also produce it as an output as well. So gateway subnet ID string dot ID. There we go. Fantastic. Cool. I should actually name that ID as well. If I go back into my main Bicep file, I will fix that so we know what we're talking about. It's always good to refactor. Fantastic. So if I go back into my app gateway, now what I want to do is actually add this, add that subnet and associate that with this application gateway. So this will be still in my properties. So this will be under gateway IP configurations. And the name of this is going to be my app gateway subnet. Properties of this will be the ID, or the subnet ID for my application gateway. Fantastic. Cool. Just make sure if I go back into my virtual network that all aligns. Want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Don't want to make any kind of mistakes. And yeah, there we go. That's fine. Cool. Okay. So now what I want to do is configure my front ends. So this front end is essentially going to be the public IP address that I'm going to assign, so we can actually access our application. So the first thing I need to do is go ahead and create that public IP address. So that's going to be a separate resource. Just going to call it public IP. That is going to sit under the Microsoft network namespace as well. So public IP addresses. That's going to be the IP address name, the location. I'm going to deploy it to the location of my resource group. I'm going to use a standard public IP address. It's got to match the SKU that I'm using for my application gateway. And again, I'm going to assign that to 1. So the zones and the SKU have to be the same. So for my properties, the public IP address version, I'm going to use IP version 4 for this. And this is going to be a static IP address. Cool. So now that that's been created, I can actually go back into my application gateway and configure that for my front end. So that will be front end IP configurations. And I'm actually going to give it a name. Let me scroll down a little bit so you guys can actually see what I'm writing. So that's going to be called my front end. And the properties of that essentially will be the public IP address. And I'm just going to need the ID of that public IP that I've created. Fantastic. Now, for just a little note here, for version 2 of your application gateway for the SKU, there has to be a public IP address or public front-end IP. You can have both a public and a private front-end IP configuration, but a private-only front-end IP configuration with no public IP is currently not supported in version 2 of the SKU. But we're going to access it through the public IP address, so that's going to be fine. Cool, so now what we want to do is set up our backend. So the backends pool is used to route requests to the appropriate backend servers. And backend pools can be composed of any combination of following resources. So it could be NICs, public IP addresses, internal IP addresses, virtual machine scale sets, fully qualified domain names, or multi-tenant backends like app service and container apps. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a backend pool that's going to target our Azure Container App. So what I need to do is add a backend address pool. I'll do that here. Scroll down a little bit so everyone can see what I'm doing. Put the mouse over here so it's out of the way. So backend address pools. Cool. So what I'm going to do for the name, it's going to be my application gateway backend pool. The properties for the backend addresses, I'm going to use the fully qualified domain name of my container app. There we go. So if I actually go into the Azure portal, this fully qualified domain name for my container app, that's going to be the fully qualified domain name that I'm going to use for my backend pool. So cool. What I need to do is go back into Visual Studio Code. Lost my space there for a second. Fantastic. Cool. So now we need to configure it. And essentially what we do when we configure that, we connect the front end to the backend pool using a routing rule. So if I go down into here and we just call this request routing rules, scroll down a little bit. So we might need to build this up as we go along, but the name essentially is going to be my application gateway routing rule. And I'm going to just add some properties to it. So the priority for this is going to be 1. And for the rule type, this is just going to be a basic rule. And I'm going to create a couple of resources. So backend address pool, HTTP listener, and then backend HTTP settings. Cool. So there's a couple of things that we need to do here. So for the backend HTTP settings, we need to actually add a setting that it's going to pick up. So I'm going to just add this above my request routing rules. So this sits under backend HTTP settings collection. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a name, and this is my application gateway backend setting. And we're going to add some properties. So for our protocol, I'm going to use HTTPS, and that means the port number is going to be 443. I'm going to add some other settings here. So I'm going to disable cookie-based affinity, the request timeout. I'm going to set for 20 seconds, and then I'm going to pick the host name from backend address equal to true. There we go. So that's my backend HTTP settings collection created. So if I go back into my HTTP settings, for the ID of that, I'm going to use the resource ID function. Microsoft, I'm actually going to copy and paste this so you guys can see that right from the get-go. There we go. So I'm going to use this resource setting. So within my application gateways, the backend HTTP settings collection, I've got my application gateway name and then also the name of the settings that I've created. So this name here should match, if I go up a little bit, the name of my settings that I've created already, which is fantastic. Now, if you want to use a custom domain, I'm not using custom domains in this example. I'm keeping this very basic. You can set listener types to multi-site. You can set all kinds of different things for custom domains and actually use the custom domain you want to use. But that's essentially what we're going to do for now for our backend settings. Cool. So next up, what I need to do is I need to set up my HTTP listener. So what I'm going to do for that is just above my request routing rules, set up a new HTTP listeners, and I'm going to give that a name. So my application gateway listener, and add some properties. So the front-end IP configuration, again, ID, I'm going to use this resource ID, and I will copy and paste this as well. But essentially, that's going to be the front end that we configured earlier. So that front end IP configuration, it's just going to point to my front end over here. So that's for my front end. So now what I need to do is add a front end port. That's what I need to do. So if I go back up here, I'll keep this underneath my front end IP configuration. So that would be front end ports. The name of that, I'm just going to say port 80, and the properties, as you can guess, port 80, and make sure I don't need to set anything there. That's pretty much it. So if I go back down into my HTTP listener, I've got my front-end IP configuration set. So now I can set my front-end port and the ID of that. Again, I'm going to copy and paste it because the resource ID is a bit of a gnarly thing to type out. But there you go. So there's my front-end port that I've configured through there. And for my protocol, I'm just going to use HTTP for that. Fantastic. Cool. So I've got my HTTP listener. I actually need to go ahead and add the resource ID for that. There we go. And then finally, for my backend address pool, I need to add the backend address pool for that as well. So that's the resource ID for that. Cool. So that's configured pretty much everything that I need to for now in terms of routing requests that come to our public IP address and make sure that route to our backend pool, which will be our container app. So also what I want to do, I'll enable HTTP2 as well. So set that to true. Cool. So now what I want to do is add a private link to my application gateway. So what I need to do, scroll up a little bit at the top here, and underneath my front-end IP configuration, I'm going to create a new private link configuration here. So the name of that is going to be my application gateway private link. So the properties for that, I'm going to use another IP configurations, and the name of that is going to be private link IP config. Properties, this is going to be my primary link. That's true. Get some more real estate going. Private IP allocation method, I'm going to make this dynamic for now, and then the subnet ID is going to be the subnet ID that I pass to my application gateway block. Cool. So now what I need to do is add another private link service for my front end. So what I need to do is go down underneath my public IP address, resource. I'm going to create a new private link service, Microsoft.network/private link services. Going to give it a name, the location, I'm going to deploy to that location, and then for the properties. So the first thing I need to do is have a configuration for my load balancer for the front-end IP. And this essentially is going to be the ID. Use that resource ID of my front-end IP configuration. So that belongs to my application gateway, which I've named my front end. So it's going to use that resource ID for that load balancer front-end IP configuration. And then what else I need to configure is the IP configuration. So just outside of this, IP configurations, that's going to be a new array of kind of objects. So the name, I'm going to give my application gateway private link config. Properties on that, again, private IP allocation method, that's going to be dynamic. Private IP address version, IP version 4. It's going to be the primary, and the subnet, I'm going to allocate it this time to my environment ID, to the subnet ID of my environment. Cool, so just to recap what we've done, essentially we've configured our application gateway just by giving it a name, also assigning it the SKU, and then we've gone ahead and assigned it a subnet. So we're going to be creating a new subnet for our application gateway. We have configured a front end for our application gateway. So our public IP address is going to be the front end for that. We've also got a kind of a front end port and also back end address pool. So we can actually route requests coming from our front end to our container app, which will be as part of our backend pool. And then we've configured some HTTP listeners, some request routing rules, and we've also hooked up private link for our application gateway to establish a secured connection to our internal only container app environment. We're using private link, so our application gateway can actually communicate with our container app through the backend, through our virtual network. Cool, so one thing that we need to do now is actually go ahead and use this module. So I'll come down here, so the module app gateway. So under network app gateway, so the name app gateway. I'm going to need a new parameter for my application gateway, which I'll actually copy and paste a couple of things that we need. So we'll need a name for our app gateway, our public IP service, and also the private link that we're going to create. So that's going to be the app gateway name. The container app fully qualified domain name, we're going to need that. So we'll use that as an output. We'll also use our environment subnet ID as an output. For our IP address name, will just be the IP address name that we're providing to the parameter. The location, the location of our service, our resource group. Perform for our private link name, and then also have another use our output for our subnet that we've created for our application gateway, and then we're going to apply some tags. Cool. So if we've done everything correctly, let's have a look at the Bicep visualizer. Just get some real estate going here. Scroll down a little bit. So yeah, we've got our subnet for our application gateway. If I scroll up a little bit here, I can see that for our application gateway, we're creating our application gateway service, also our private link service as well, and our public IP address. And then we're also integrating that with our container app environment. So it looks like we have everything good and ready to go. So I'll go back into my main.bicep file, scroll up a little bit, and let's go ahead and deploy that. We'll leave that running and we'll see what happens when we come back. Cool, so that's gone ahead and deployed our application gateway along with the public IP address. So now for the big finale. What we need to do is verify that the public IP address for our application gateway is going to point to our container app. So there's our front-end public IP address. So click on that. That will take us to the resource that we created. So what we're going to do, just get that public IP address, enter it, and there it is. So there's our container app. So now what's happening is, rather than going to the container app directly, so if I actually try and do that, go to that container app and hit this endpoint here, that can't be reached because it's an internal environment. The container app is deployed in an internal environment. Instead, now we're actually using a public IP address that's associated with our application gateway, and we were able to access it via the application gateway, which is pretty cool. Now, this was a very basic example. We didn't talk about custom domain names, which is probably a little bit more applicable. And there are also things that you can do with Azure Front Door, also WAF policies related to application gateway that I didn't cover in this. So if you have any advanced scenarios that you'd like me to do, please leave a comment below and I'll get some time, carve some time out of my day to go through those examples and build those up from scratch. So that's the end of this video. If you liked it, give it a like. If you have any questions about this, please leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. No matter where you are in the world, I hope you're having a great day, and we will see you all next time.